It is rare. And one of the reasons that a lot of investors prefer 2 or 3 person leadership teams is you can have somebody who's an amazing leader who can rally the troops, rally investors, rally all of your stakeholders. And then if you have an innovator, whether they're, a CTO or a CIO, or in today's world, even like a chief
Hmm.
design officer or
Creative.
somebody who has some other like very specific skills, depending on the business model, depending on the tech.
Welcome to the podcast, where we introduce you to incredible humans who share their journeys with the mission to inspire you to harness your own inner tenacity to drive your life and career forward. And now, your host, Adam Posner.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast, where I bring in the best and the brightest from the world of business, marketing, and personal growth to help you harness your inner tenacity and drive your career forward. Entrepreneurship is in Lauren Perkins' DNA. An expert at scale, she started and helmed multiple companies before pivoting into corporate innovation and venture building, helping thousands of startups and corporate innovations succeed. She is best known as General Assembly founding instructor, Columbia University entrepreneur in residence, and most recently managing director at Microsoft for Startups, and the author of 2 books, The Community Manager's Playbook and brand new book, Think Like a Brand, Act Like a Startup, out now. We will unpack her journey and so much more. Let's get to it. Lauren, welcome to the podcast.
Well, hello. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for taking so much care and effort and mindfulness in the tech setup for the podcast. It is so appreciative, because everyone who's listening right now, if we didn't go through this, you would hear Lauren in an echo chamber, and it probably wouldn't be that good to listen to. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
We got there. So Lauren has a really interesting background, and we'll get to all that kind of good stuff in a minute. I mean, quite the journey. Quite the journey. But I think it's important that we hit the rewind button. And I've been doing this for a bit on recent shows, and my audience who's been listening for a while, I'm kind of on this kick of the real origin story. Like, what did your parents do for a living, Lauren?
So, my dad is a data engineer, and my mom did communications, but she was this fabulous visual artist. And in most of our childhood homes, and I say homes because she did this more than once because we moved a couple times, and she painted these like 2-story murals in like
Wow.
our kitchen and our living room. So she was an amazing visual artist, but I think she just didn't feel like that was something that could be a career. As an Italian immigrant, it was like you needed to work and do something. And then she had my sister. She mostly focused on raising us. But she definitely taught us all of those negotiation skills from her comms days.
So it was so the kind of entrepreneurship was in the blood early on, and the tech side coming from your dad.
Very early, like even from a sports standpoint, like my
Mm.
dad's engineering background came in all the time because I grew up as a competitive swimmer, and my dad was a runner and had played rugby and football, so he's very into sports, but he applied like that data lens to everything that he did. And so he was like my second coach who had the spreadsheets of like all of the things
Your
that was
times, your trial times,
all those
what is it,
micro
sprints?
details. Yeah. So he
Oh
would,
my God.
every single, like when it was swimming, because he then did it for track and, later for triathlons when he and I started doing them together as a way to bond. It was
Cool.
like every single, stroke and every single race. And then it was broken down by, the start and the lap and, all of those micro details. So by the time it got to triathlons, it was like everything was reverse engineered by race. And then, if there were multiple races in a season, it was like, okay, what's the one that we're really trying to crush it at?
It's so interesting too when you think about that. So that analytical mindset, and being able to really apply quant and qual
Hmm.
metrics to improving yourself really really early on. Where did the journalism bug come from? Was that something that you had in early on? Were you like a creative writer as a kid?
So I had a really fascinating childhood that I don't get to talk about that much. So thank you for
Yeah, let's get
asking.
into it.
So I started as a journalist in high school, and the story behind it is fascinating. So I was one of those kids that was always like a little bit of a go getter, and so I was in the play. It was actually like a play in high school, and so whoever was running the PR was like one of the moms. and she needed some help. So I offered to write the press release. And then of course she like edited it. And then my dad,
Right.
Being, the analytical, edited it even more. And he was like, now you can go pitch this. And so I pitched it to the local newspaper, and they really liked it. They were like, this is like way better done than most of the pitches we get for like high school stuff.
Oh, this is fantastic.
So then they were like, could you actually write the story? And so I wrote the story for them, and I, had a bunch of photos. I took some photos when I wasn't in scenes, and then for scenes that, my parents helped me out with like an assist there. And so then I gave them the article with like the photos and everything. They were like, this is fantastic. They were like, could you write for us? So I went back home and talked to my dad, and I was like, I want to say yes. Can you help me? And my dad actually was a fabulous writer, but like he did everything very methodically, as you would expect with like a data engineering brain.
Data informed content.
Data informed content for sure. And so I went back to the paper and I was like, I would love to. Now it turns out that because they had asked, if I was like involved, they assumed that I was in college,
really?
That I was like an alumni who was like helping, like, like had like a younger sibling, or like my mom was the one helping with like PR or something. So it wasn't until they had to give me my tax forms that they asked for like my license and all of this stuff. And I was like, oh, I don't have a license.
What?
And they were like,
how old are you?
They were like, how are you getting to your stories? And like, how are you getting these people to talk to you? And I was like, well, actually being a sophomore in high school is actually really useful because you can get the mayor to talk to you because they think it's adorable that they're getting interviewed by a kid. So I leveraged my youth, and then I kind of just used that to get more opportunities. And you play the cards that you've got to give, right?
That's what you got to do. So you had it in your blood. You had to do that. And then after school, first role at the Boston Globe, and we're not going to put a date on it too, but we could take a look.
Oh no, I was young.
we could assume that. What was Boston Globe? I mean, Boston's a tough city, right? Working in a local newspaper, working in one of the biggest newspapers in the country. Was that a culture kind of shock to you coming into that environment? How did you adapt that? How did you get involved, as they like to say? How'd you get in the mix?
That's a fantastic question. I had no idea like what I was getting myself into. Similar to writing for the high school newspaper, I just sort of thought I belonged there because I'd been doing local news. And one of the reasons they wanted to hire me was I was in school at Northeastern getting a business degree, and I had a minor in journalism and PR. And so I had a lot of comms experience. But they loved that I had all these connections to local news, and they let me write both for the paper as well as do marketing. And I actually got to work on the Patriots account.
Oh, cool.
Which was actually really fun for me. And I'm one of those girls that like could ask all the stupid questions of like the coach, and they're like, I guess we'll put up with your stupid questions. You clearly do not know what you're talking about when it comes to football. But I asked enough questions that I could actually tell a really good story because I wasn't making assumptions because I knew too much. And so I applied that same thing at the Boston Globe. And I think what the Boston Globe taught me more than anything was how to work with so many diverse players, how to collect information from multiple sources of information. Because the Globe wasn't going to be like the local paper that I start out with, which was literally called the Hometown Weekly. The Globe, if you needed 3 different sources of information to publish, to
verify a data point.
Exactly, to verify it. And so it really taught me like customer discovery and market research without it knowing I was gaining all of those skills. So it actually ended up being quite useful like later down the line.
So, I mean, you were covering the Patriots. Was this during the Bledsoe era, or are we in the early Brady years?
So I actually got to work on, so I actually was doing more. So for the paper, I was for the writing side, I was covering local news because I had all the local news connections. On the Patriots, I was doing like copywriting and editing. And it was the year that this would have been the 2002-2003 season, where all of a sudden they went from being nobodies to, getting their first ring. And I mean, even I was like super surprised. And it just like also like Boston was on
Right.
fire. Like Boston
The
is like, so
Sox
I
were
grew up there
winning,
as well as
right? The Sox were
the
winning.
Sox were winning. They were doing quite well. And then the Patriots were, we
It's a
all of a
great
sudden just
sports
like went
city.
through this
Yeah.
era. It's like the energy. So when you ask like, what was the culture like, it was looking back, it was actually a really tough culture, but like the energy in Boston at the time was so strong. And I think sometimes like the naivete of like beginner's
Mm-hmm.
luck of like getting the right opportunity at the right time. And because I'd been at a paper before, I felt like I belonged there. So I think it took me a while to realize like, oh, I'm actually an outsider here. I'm the young
Interesting.
kid. I'm super hungry.
Was
And, I'm just talking to everybody. I'm networking my way around the
Did it
organization.
at the time? Did it still have that kind of old school, male dominated, dare I say, sexist kind of feel in the on the floor of the Boston Globe?
Yes, and one of my bosses actually used to jokingly say, "Stop hanging out with the boys in the basement for Boston.com." And I remember retorting back, I was like, "You have no idea what Boston.com is going to become." And they just thought I wanted to hang out with the boys. And I was like, no, there's not a woman that I met on the Boston.com team back then. There might have been one. I just didn't meet her. And so it was like a combination of, because it also used to be union. So you had all the
Ah,
union workers working on the paper. You had mostly male reporters, and then
especially on the sports side. Yeah.
like yeah, and then mostly like male execs. Like I don't there was like one or two females that like I sort of looked up
But
to, and that was in the days where women didn't really think there was a lot of room for another woman. So it was
mm,
actually easier to find mentors that were men because there was more of them to, your
that's
hit ratio would go up. If you asked 10, maybe
yeah. I
one
mean,
would say
that's
yes.
that's an interesting perspective too, and I think that just obviously living in Boston. I mean, listen, the I love Boston. I am a diehard New York Mets fan, so the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So I'm a Boston Red Sox fan, and I love going up there. I haven't been up there in a couple of years, but it's a great town. It's a great
Yeah,
city, and you were alluding to earlier. I mean, fitness and sports has been a common thread in your life. Um, Tell us a
for
little bit
sure.
about FitFly Global. How did that come about?
So FlyFit
Sorry, Fly
was
Fit. Sorry, tongue
FlyFit. I
ties.
know. Say that 10 times fast. It was great for SEO
Right,
optimization.
right.
So FlyFit was really like three of my favorite things. It was fitness, it was travel, and it was startups. And it was really, really hard because we were looking to build fitness studios in airports behind security. And the whole
Hmm.
ambition was we wanted to change the way that people traveled. At the time that we were building it, I had status on three different airlines, which doesn't seem like a lot, but like you have to be traveling like every single week
Yeah.
multiple times in order to, have that kind of that travel like points and like that whole like setup. And I just remember that the more that I traveled, the more I fell away from what was like a core root to me, which was that well being, that fitness. And there wasn't anything that was healthy to do in
Just
the
eat.
airports.
Sit
Yeah,
and sit
eat
and
and
sit and
drink
eat and
and
drink and eat
and
and
then
drink and
and
sit.
sit and then especially if you're connecting. So like when Heathrow invested in us, one of the premises was if we could get one of the top five airports,
Right.
international airports in the world to either like JV or partner with us or invest in us, or ideally both, like we should be able to de-risk the
Mhm.
venture. But also it was, we had this hypothesis that it would allow us to validate that like what we were trying to do was actually something that like the world wanted because they were going to put both money and resources into it. And so
But let's talk about something interesting. Like right now, you're obviously very
yeah.
experienced in this world of startup from a technical investment capital standpoint, but I assume you didn't really have that. What was that learning curve like? I mean, now you're throwing around all these acronyms and this and that, but like back then you didn't. What was that learning curve like? How did you really start to
Yeah.
understand this world? Because I mean, I have a very good knowledge of it. I recruit in this space, so I understand it. But most people
Hmm.
don't. They really don't understand how it works, and they think, "Oh, I'm just going to throw money in, and we're going to 10x. We're going to be a unicorn. Everyone's going to make money." That's not always the way it works.
Well, as a founder, I did write quite a few checks, and I was our first check. So, I mean, you definitely have to put like
Of
skin in
course.
the game. And I do think that investors really respect that because they know that you are all in. There's also a lot of lessons that I've learned about being all in and the types of things that founders need to do in order to give themselves the stability they need to take that type of like massive risk on a regular basis. Um, but that's sort of like a different rabbit hole. I think that really the question that you're asking is like, how do you
Mm-hmm.
learn all of those things, right? And I had been in the startup world for quite a while. At that point, not only had I already gone through, the whole life cycle for General Assembly, from ideation on a napkin before there was a physical space to, the community that got built for founders. And I think it was a lot of that sort of part of the startup ecosystem. So we're talking like 2010, right, to like
Yeah, it was the
2014,
heyday.
the heyday. And I think that, it's so funny because my right hand at Microsoft, he and I had been sort of two people that felt like diversity in the New York City tech scene. So I had moved to New York after university and spent a lot of my startup career in New York, some of it in San Fran, and then obviously London with FlyFit. And I think you learn these things by like, yeah, you can read the
It's not till you're
books,
in there.
but I think it's like you have to have access to people, and then you have to be willing to ask questions. And I think journalism really prepared me to be able to like ask the stupid questions. And I think that actually, and I say stupid on purpose, because if we're not willing to like take our ego out of it and ask something that we're like, they probably think I should know this, then you're not going to learn it. So whether you ask another founder, and so there's definitely like founder communities that I was in that I think helped. But a lot of it was just taking the risk, asking a
And I
lot
and
of
I and I and I
questions.
certainly glazed over General Assembly for a bit in those early days. I mean, General Assembly. Let's kind of hit the rewind on there and talk about General Assembly. How did General Assembly at first come on your radar? I mean, it was the building blocks.
Yeah, it's actually a great story. So Brad Hargraves, one of the co-founders, he was the entrepreneur in residence at Tipping Point, which was a serial entrepreneur co-working space in Tribeca. And my old consulting practice that did like a lot of CMO as a service and corporate innovation work with more corporate folks that were trying to act like a startup. So he was the EIR there, and so I was his first customer for the workspace. And so when he and Matt and a couple of the other guys were working on General Assembly, he was like, "You were such a critical customer." He's like, "Could you like give me that real deal feedback as we
Mm-hmm.
start to like contemplate and build out GA?" And I was like, I was just being myself. Like, and some of that was the journalist like asking a lot of questions, and
Can't
some of
take the
it was
girl out of the
asking
paper.
permission to say, exactly. But some of it was also just like, how, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how honest do you want me to be? And some of that's also New York,
Yeah,
right?
New
So
York and
he was
Boston have that
asking
in
for
common, right?
feedback, and I was
Mm-hmm.
like, and
Radical
New York and Boston
candor, whether you
definitely
like
have
it or
that
not,
in common.
it's coming at
Radical
you.
candor, not not necessarily the same in California, but it was so valuable. And I realized that something that I innately had like baked into me was really valuable in the startup world, not just from a customer standpoint, but then as I started advising startups and teaching them. And I often use that scale of like 1 to 10 because we all have really hard days as founders where we don't need a
I need
10 on
I need a
feedback,
soft 7
or
today.
we're like, can you give me a 7? Or if you're going to give me the 10, can you really kind of like, can you soften the delivery and also help me find
That's
the solution? Because I'm not resourced enough to like get the harsh feedback. And I think that that's where doing it multiple times. And like the community at General Assembly was amazing because I taught thousands of founders and their people by the time I was
yeah. I
building
mean, you were
FlyFit.
basically
And at
teaching
that point, I was
yourself.
also
You were ready to go. Well,
yeah. But this is like, teaching and building at the same time. So I was actually at Columbia University as an EIR while I was building FlyFit. Um, and this was, at the time I wasn't teaching that much at General Assembly because I
wait,
just had
I want to
so much on my
kind of
plate. But all those
communities.
communities
I want
help.
to kind of go back to something around feedback too. And I never even thought about this. Is
Hmm.
when you're in a position to give feedback, when that's part of the conversation, is asking somebody, how much of this feedback do you want? Do you want the full Monty? Do you want a 10 or do you want a 7, depending on what they're feeling, their emotional state, and where they are in the day, right? Or where they are, like, and coming to meet
1,000%.
them. And then maybe like, yeah, start with a 7, you give it to them at 7. You're like, you know what? That wasn't so bad. Give me a 9.5 over here. Right. Like,
Yep.
and it gives you the ability to
Exactly. You
scale
can
up.
always start at a 5 and you can
That's,
scale it up, but you starting at a 10,
and
often the ego gets in the way if you're not feeling
I am,
resourced. But I don't, there's an,
no,
sorry, go
I'm
ahead.
saying it's almost like the same way when I talk about like emotional agility too. You know, when you're talking about
Hmm.
empathy and compassion too, like you shouldn't always have to go fully down to someone's level, because then you may not be in the best place to help them, versus being a few levels above so you could see above the clouds and really be able to help them as best you can. So it's just an interesting.
Well, yes, and like I think that there's another thing that I would add to it. So that construct I find to be really helpful, and anyone that's listening, it's like a great one to borrow. But another layer to add to it that can be like just really helpful and practical in these types of conversations. And I think us all getting better at having hard conversations is so
Mm,
important in the world that we're living in today. Another one is what role do you want me to, or what lens do you want me to listen from? And depending on the person, role might be appropriate, lens might be appropriate. But like, let's say that that you're on the board of the company, but you also know the founder personally. Like, am I listening from my friend hat? Am I listening from a board hat? Do you want me to listen as a potential investor? Like, even if I don't have money in the company, like what perspective do you want me to be listening from? Because sometimes, like with other founders, what I've learned is they actually just need you to
yes.
fucking hear them out. Like they just need to rant and get it off of their chest. And if you then come in with like all of this like really practical feedback, or you like add to it by, by experience sharing, they're like, sometimes people just
Let
need
it
to vent.
go.
And I learned this in my personal relationships probably way too late in life, but it's also really helpful because a lot of the work that I've done, and you touched on this at the Globe, being a female in tech, like I was often one of the only women. So that softness can be really helpful in a culture with a lot of men, because then you can bring like a different perspective. But then you need to also ask what roles do you want me to play right now? Or,
Absolutely.
what perspective do you want me to come into the
And thank you so much for
conversation?
sharing that perspective. I think it's really critical, you know, within these startup organizations, because you're building the culture. And one of the core parts of culture that people don't always talk about
Mm-hmm.
is feedback. How do we like to give feedback? Because so many organizations for a while, people are, you know, they're trepidatious about giving feedback. But the companies that are open, and it is radical candid, but radical candid with the framework of not everyone just coming right at your face with what they dislike about something, but having a framework to make it constructive as possible is important. And I think those elements of startups, talking about the culture, not just the product. We could talk about product all day long. We could talk about
Mm-hmm.
MVPs and scaling and you know, go to market strategies and all that, but talking about how to actually build an organization. Because correct me if I'm wrong on this, it's just my observation. Most startups
For
that
sure.
I work with, that I've seen, that are in my kind of sphere, they're mostly tech founders. It's mostly somebody who's coming up with the product or the service, and they're not always people. They're not always organizational people, right?
There's a
There's a
lot.
delta there. There's a
Exactly.
delta.
There's a lot of technical founders or subject matter experts. And
But
that
you
could
know what
be
I'm
like when you're talking
saying?
about health tech, it could be a doctor. It's like you've got a lot of doctors, you've got a lot of engineers, or sometimes you've got people that have like that sales
Hmm.
background, right? And so they're coming at it from a different perspective. And I think there's one thing when it comes to culture that I want to like dig into, which is, and this is something that the more I do it, the more I want to continue to lean into it and also support other people in doing it, is, are you leading from your heart
Hmm.
or are you leading from your head? And when you're thinking about culture, because sometimes I think we're afraid that if we like open up on the heart, that like we're going to get judged for it. We're going to be so vulnerable when things are risky and we're taking those risks that it may not be received. But the more that I continue to like lead from heart, and I'll just give you an example. Like if I've got a team and I'm not feeling
Hmm.
very resourced, it actually makes a big difference to say, I'm not feeling very resourced today. And so I may not be as skillful or as mindful in the words that I use or in the ways that I ask you things. So if this conversation or if what we're doing today doesn't feel as good, like feel free to say something. But then it gives people permission to also say when they're not, because it's not saying I'm having a shitty day. It's like I'm not feeling resourced, right? That's very different because then you also give your team or if you're on a leadership team, the ability to say, how can I support you? And the more
I like
that we
that.
do that, the better behavior that we have in startups. Because often when I see what happens is bad behavior comes from being afraid to talk about the hard stuff or the emotional stuff, because there's so much
Ego
identity
too.
tied in.
Yeah.
And if you put your own money in, you've got ego, you've got money, you've got so many layers to it. And I think the more that we lead from heart while still being mindful, the better the culture that we build. And then when other people in the team feel that way, they're not scared to say, I'm stuck, or I'm feeling like I'm not like being successful, or I can't contribute, and then it becomes, let's solve it together. Let's work through what this looks like. What do you need as a human as part of this team and the organization?
Curve, right? And there's a learning curve, especially if founders, I mean, I've had this conversation too multiple times. Like, first of all, you don't always need a co-founder. And I find that the best relationships are when there really is a yin and yang kind of relationship where there's a balance there. You know, two co-founders are doing and acting and doing the same thing isn't always, it's usually a recipe for disaster. But what are some of those hallmarks that you see early on, like those early indicators, like this person is going to be a solid, successful founder?
Oh, well, it's a hard question. And I'm going to answer it very, very candidly. Some of the founders that make the best innovators are not always the best leaders. So the question is, I think it's so important early on for people who have the right ingredients to be successful to figure out what their leadership style is. Because often what happens is a lot of people try to emulate somebody else's leadership style. They want to be Steve Jobs, or they want to be Elon Musk. And if you are not naturally that person, you're just going to be out of alignment and out of integrity from day one.
Be true to yourself.
Which means anytime anything goes wrong, you're going to make decisions out of alignment. You are going to be operating from a place of fear or ego, etc. So there's two answers to that question. And the reason I sort of broke it out is a lot of people can learn to lead. The best founders either have amazing leadership capabilities or amazing innovation capabilities. There are some that have both. Now, one of the reasons it is rare, and one of the reasons that a lot of investors prefer 2 or 3 person leadership teams is you can have somebody who's an amazing leader who can rally the troops, rally investors, rally all of your stakeholders. And then if you have an innovator, whether they're, a CTO or a CIO, or in today's world, even like a chief design officer or somebody who has some other like very specific skills, depending on the business model, depending on the tech, you can put the right sauce together by putting a couple different people on that founding team. Now, at the same time, and I have also personally experienced this, the wrong co-founder is worse than doing it yourself. But doing it yourself is also really, really hard. Like, they're just different kinds of hard. And I think one of the things, if you are going to have co-founders, that's really important is, have you fire tested the relationship during bad times?
Well,
and you can even simulate it, right?
How do you simulate that? Is it kind of like, hey, someone who kind of knows that they want to do this, maybe like a third party comes in and lights a fire?
You can certainly do that. I mean, one of the things that I have tried to do, and not everyone's always interested in doing, but I normally find when people are not willing to do it, that it's actually an indicator, is create an operating agreement from day one.
It's almost like
if you're going to have a co-founder. So like when it's 1,000% a prenup. And if you really want to be successful, you hire like a coach, and or like you do business therapy from the beginning. Because when I founded FlyFit, because you brought that up, I had both a therapist for the first time in my entire life and a coach that I was working on. And things still did not go according to plan. But I learned, it never does, but I learned so much more about myself. I became an exponentially better leader. And also, if somebody is not willing to do that work in order to lead the right organization and the right culture, it also tells you a lot about whether they are going to be flexible and adaptable on the human things when things are hard. And I think that's it's such a sticking point in the startup world. Like, can you stay in alignment in that triangle of thinking and feeling and doing? Because it's really like a triangle that keeps you as a leader in alignment.
Too. I mean, literally, I'm looking down at my notes here, and you pretty much covered a whole bunch of topics that I wanted to discuss in one robust, and
we can double click on any of them.
But people are probably curious: how does someone land a job at Microsoft? Did Microsoft come looking for you, or did you go looking for them?
They asked me.
What was that process like?
They did. So it's fascinating because I actually said no at one point, and the recruiter was like, "You do realize that 6,500 other people applied for the job and really fucking want it." And my first response was, "That's fantastic. Maybe you should ask one of the other finalists who's super excited that this is their culture." And so a lot of the questions I had around whether it was the right fit for me was really around culture, alignment. Also, was I going to have the autonomy to lead?
But this wasn't a traditional Microsoft team,
because I'm a very
traditional
people first
corporate Microsoft. This was, correct me if I'm right.
It's Microsoft for startups. Yeah.
And in that name itself, you would so there's the thing too. You have all these large enterprise corporations that have all their spinoffs, they have all their VCs and PCs and everything. Mm-hmm. But are they really going to let them be autonomous, or is it just kind of a name? Right. So you you have to ask those questions. You have to, do some back channeling, right? You need to figure out, are they putting their money where their mouth is, and are they really going to be what they say?
I mean, honestly, the thing that I can say transparently in answer to that is, when times are good, it often is easy to say, here is how I want to lead the organization. Here is how I want to do things. And then, like during COVID, for example, we had a change in VP leadership above me, and everyone leads differently. And that's one of the things with a corporate environment that can be challenging for startup organizations, startup studios, innovation labs, all the different flavors that show up of startup in the corporate world. Is you have to have champions that, if they don't fully understand the startup world, are willing to give enough ownership and autonomy. And it's amazing how that ebb and flow can happen, because you can have some people, like the first guy that I worked for, Chad, was acquired through, he came in through an acquisition. He was the CTO of a startup previously. And he loved the way that I focused on people first, both internally and customer. He was like, I love that lens. And one of the other guys who was very instrumental in bringing me on, Ian, was like a longtime Microsofter. And so we had a lot of conversations. I was like, we're not going to agree a lot. And so before I started, I was like, how are we going to work through that? Because you're a longtime Microsofter, and I'm a longtime.
When you're very it's not personal. It's just like, I could tell by your background, and by the way, we've had some we're just not going to agree a lot.
That was the thing. It was like,
discuss productively. How do we
1,000%
argue productively?
Yeah. And this was, it was so funny because I think he was surprised that I brought it up. And I was like, let's just be honest. You're hiring me because I don't look or act or behave the way that you do. And you need somebody to come in that's going to do things differently. And the number one reason that the team at Microsoft for Startups wanted me to join was because not only had I taught thousands of founders and advised, dozens, but also at FlyFit, I went to market with corporate resources. I leveraged their marketing. I leveraged their operations, like all of that. And they were like, we want, a founder who truly looks and feels like our customers, because they'll relate to you and they'll talk to you honestly. But then also from an internal standpoint, you can help us figure out, how do we leverage all of the resources at Microsoft?
Right, how do you find,
so that was really,
I love that.
When we agreed,
you have the institutional knowledge, you have the IP, you fully understand how this organization works. How do I take my not knowing that and use it actually as an advantage, where you're leveraging your strengths of knowing the organization?
1,000%.
So
and it's the best way of doing stakeholder management. Like there was one. And honestly, most founders suck at stakeholder management because they wanted to be founders to have freedom and autonomy. And then they realize that if you take investors or build an advisory board, like you are starting to like give that up. And I do think stakeholder management is super, super important. And I will admit, like Microsoft absolutely stretched my people and leadership capabilities. And also I joined in 2019. And then like a year later, we were going through the COVID crisis. And there were tons of people changes and resource changes. And, also we had to make decisions between COVID critical support when it came to projects, like Azure.
You had to shift to remote
cloud,
working
all
tools.
of that, as well as, and it wasn't for us. Like our team was already fully remote for the Microsoft for Startups team for the most part. We had pockets around the world that had like small satellite offices, but a lot of us were already remote. And I started remote from day one. I was like, we're going to have, a distributed global team, and I am going to lead by example and start from remote. Like if you want to tag me to an office, like that's fine. But, so but we had to support education. We had to support
shift priorities based on global
everyone
pandemic,
moving
right?
to teams.
Understood.
So there was just like, one of the things that I thought might have been different was there was these constant sort of shifts. And I think that one of the things that we did during COVID that touches on this leadership conversation that started with some of that stakeholder management, but it was like, here's what I know right now. And with the information that I know right now, these are the decisions that I think make the most sense. But also taking ownership and accountability for the context in the world may change as soon as we hang up. And let's make it acceptable and okay that as that context changes, nobody is wrong and no strategy is failing, which then means no human that made the decisions behind it is failing if the context changes. Then we just say, we're going to make a new decision because of XYZ information or XYZ shift in the context. And so it was actually a really productive way of handling that total instability and agility in a way that made people feel in their nervous system more stable, saying, we actually need to make a different decision now.
That is like so have that be constant. Because one of the points that you brought up, like in the prep here, is discussing the paradoxical concepts of like stability and agility, and how do you balance those two? And I think you kind of alluded to a lot here. How does such a large organization and a subset within that organization move quick to respond to something that no one could have predicted? How could they still be stable in their approach and their process, but also at the same time be agile to responding to unforeseen issues and what's happening in the world, and hyper local as well?
1000%. So, I mean, one of the things that big organizations inherently do well is they are very stable.
So a lot of people are drawn to them from an employment perspective.
And exactly. And they have their own ways that they're agile. And startups are sort of known for being, just constantly pivoting, constantly on the move. What I have found is that even though AI is advancing at an exponential rate, decisions are still made by humans. And humans inherently need stability in order to have like any agility, right? So if organizations are led by humans and then like all of the work inside of the organization is mostly executed by humans with the support of technology, we really actually have to build organizations that are optimized for humans, not for the processes necessarily and the technology, although those then support it. So one of the most important things is, how do you create stability and agility? And at any point in time, you're somewhere on that continuum. So before COVID, in a larger organization, you might have been somewhere over here where you're like mostly stable with some agility. So, basically the big agility when you're not in crisis is, what are the things that we're going to test? And then if we validate them, then how are we going to optimize them and then operationalize them? And then it brings you back to that stable end of the continuum. During a crisis of any kind, we'll use COVID since we're talking about it, then you end up using that stable foundation. Hopefully you've got stable processes. Hopefully you have, even just like meeting structures, the way that things flow. The way that you prioritize, like that stuff can actually, if you do it well, can make the humans inside of an organization feel much more stable because the process is stable. And so I'm actually exactly, it's the foundation. So one of the biggest things that I find is that experimentation actually can be extremely stable if you do it consistently, you measure it the same way, you get the processes aligned. So the agile things is what you put
Right.
in as the like inputs. Now during crisis, often you move to the other end of the spectrum and you're very, very agile for a period of time. And I think what challenged a lot of people, and sort of is now with like how fast AI is moving, right? It's a different input. When things are shifting exponentially, you're on the agile end of the spectrum. And really the question is what do the humans in the organization need to feel stable? And that often starts with the leaders. Like you have to model it, you have to embody it. And you also need to check in with your people around like, what is it that you need? And also as you learn your people, what you need, Adam, and what I need might be different. And knowing that each individual leader and then their teams underneath them need to understand these dynamics. Like that's where you can create a ton of stability, but also, you know, if you're looking at like HBR and, you know, psychological safety, like organizations will not take exponential risk, especially for prolonged periods of time without safety.
We're heading into the back nine here of the conversation, and you in your career have interviewed, hired, fired lots of people. People have come your way, and you need to assess their skill, their character, and their values. I assume by the time most people get to you, the skill has pretty much been vetted by other folks on the team, and now you're looking for like that vibe, that feel, their values. How do you assess that in an interview? What's kind of your you know, Lauren Perkins kind of secret go-to interview questions?
So I'm very untraditional. The number one thing that I look for is somebody coachable.
What are coachable type questions? Or conversations, like how do you assess that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, Adam, are you coachable? Yeah, I'm coachable. Okay, great. Check. Give me an example of how you were coached once. Well, one time I got feedback from my past employer. They said I wasn't doing but that's like canned answers, right? But like,
well, one way is like you try to use like experiential interviewing techniques, and you have somebody walk you through a crisis. Now, the best way of doing it is you pick a skill that you know that they are not a 10 out of a 10 on.
You can pick that up.
You as an interviewer at least are above average level at. Like it needs to be something that you inherently understand, that you know the person that you're interviewing is not a pro at. And one of the ways of doing it is, so for example, Paulina, who was my other right hand at Microsoft, she was originally hired to be my events person. We were doing a ton of in-person events and community, and she had a background in it. And she had been at a startup, like I think for like a year outside of all of her events experience. But I had interviewed her around a number of things that led me to believe that she was coachable. So when COVID happened and there were no events, I had to make a decision like, okay, is this still somebody that makes sense? And so I basically, like, I'll just use it as an example. I know that she would be fine with it because she ended up being extremely successful. And I think everyone at Microsoft for startups would agree. I asked her, I was like, okay, you have a foundational skill around the chaos of events and like shepherding the details and the humans and all of the things. I'm like, tell me how you would apply that in a fully remote world. So you take something that they know and you ask them to apply it to something that you know that they don't know or that they are, you know, average at best at. And then you use opportunities in what they share with you to coach them and see how they respond when you insert, but what if I suggested you do this instead? How would you then follow through with that? What questions
are they getting defensive in their answers? Are they eye-opening? Are they open to feedback? Are they holding it so close to their chest? Are they excited? Are they asking questions? Are they leaning in? Or are they starting to get
clammy and sweaty? And like you can tell that they're like, oh fuck, I'm out of my depth.
So let's bring home Lauren. What's keeping you up at night these days? What's worrying you in the world and business and AI taking over, deep fakes, election, all that kind of terrible nonsense?
I do think the elections is going to suck a lot of oxygen out of the room, so to say.
I'm scared.
But that is not, that's not necessarily the number. That's not keeping me up at night, although I think it's true. So I'm going to acknowledge it and acknowledge you sharing that. I think the biggest thing that's keeping me up at night, I think there's two things, and they're both equally important for very different reasons. How do we create cultures that can support like the people's health and well-being and sustainable performance? Because at the end of the day, that also impacts whether the organization can be sustainable. Otherwise, you're just going to turn people, like just be turning and churning through people and burn out. And then I think the second thing is, which is also kind of related, is how do we improve the
How do we
failure
improve
rates
the
in
failure
startups?
rates?
Because it has, like on average, it hasn't changed. But there are portfolios of startups that I've worked with where the success rate is exponentially different than the average. And Microsoft for Startups is an example, but there's also a lot of filtering in order to get into it. And it's only, B2B,
Mhm.
B2B, like mostly tech companies who get a lot of SaaS. And then you've got like portfolios like Mass Challenge, um, that have a similar approach to my whole think like a brand, act like a startup approach, which I feel like it got validated at scale at Microsoft because so many startups were leveraging both the big brand stability and the startup agility. So really those are the two things that keep me up at night is like how do we make sure that the
Mm,
humans in the organizations like find ways of staying
I dig
healthy
it.
and inspired and creative, not burnt out. And then also at the same time, from an organizational level, like how do we change the failure rates? Because that'll support both the humans and the organizational
Awesome. So
success
real
and
quick, new book
sustainability.
is out. Depending when the show airs,
Your book is
we're
out.
looking into the future in the glass. We're looking in early July. Hope everyone had a great Memorial Day weekend and a great June here. But Lauren's new book is out. It's called
Hmm.
"Think Like a Brand, Act Like a Startup," and I will link it up in the comments here. But who is this book for? Real quick, who's this book for?
It's for entrepreneurs and innovators that want to leverage the stability of big brands and the agility of startups, and they want to drive growth,
I dig it. I
impact,
dig
and
it. And Lauren,
innovation.
let's bring it home here. What is that single greatest piece of advice that you've ever received that you take action on daily? That's a spin on the old classic question.
Mm. Honestly, I think it's that constant like where am I from a resource standpoint? And then do I need more stability in my life or can I take more risk and be more agile? Because when we're not resourced, we're not going to do great work. We're not going to be great partners or friends or colleagues. And so that's something I think I've also just learned a lot more in these like later years, which is like, how do we like resource ourselves so that we show up in all the things that we're doing,
I
in
absolutely
the
dig it.
best way
And last but
possible?
not least, it's been great to learn about your life and your career journey. And throughout that, I get these themes of real grit, tenacity, hard work. But there were those times where you had to overcome those challenges, right? There were those times you had to really dig down deep and pull yourself up. And now you sit here, you're sharing your knowledge of the world, you're building, you're continuing to educate and bring up other founders. What keeps you focused in life? What is your compass? Lauren Perkins, what is your North Star in life?
I mean, that North Star is like how do I help entrepreneurs and innovators struggle less and succeed more and enjoy the journey? I think it's an important part. Like building a venture is a journey. The world needs us to design
Hmm.
a different future than we presently have. Like designing the future is actually something that I'm really excited about. And I think entrepreneurs and innovators are in the best position to make an impact in all of the different things that we need to redesign and recreate. And the possibilities are endless if we use that creativity and we tap into our inner resources and resource ourselves, and then we can resource the
Tremendous. Love
challenges
it.
that need to be solved.
I want to thank you. It's been a fantastic
Hmm.
conversation. Certainly appreciate your time.
Thank
I want
you.
everyone to check out
Fantastic.
Lauren's
Thanks,
two
Adam.
books. The first one that's out, The Community Manager's Playbook, and the new book, Think Like a Brand, Act Like a Startup, out now. Anywhere else where people could follow you, where could they connect? Where could they learn more, Lauren?
The channel that I'm the most excited about, and it is not influenced
There
by
you go.
Microsoft, is LinkedIn. I think that LinkedIn is the place. So I'm easy to find. I'm a top voice for entrepreneurship on LinkedIn, and that's the channel that I'm investing the most
That's
in.
awesome. Thank you so much for joining me, and everyone
Love it.
listening. If this show resonated with you, leave a review, rating. It goes a long way. Sharing means caring. Please spread the word. Please follow us on all the social media channels. Definitely check us out on YouTube. We're trying to grow the YouTube channel. Very easy. YouTube.com/the podcast. Instagram, you can find us at NHP Talent. And we appreciate everybody for tuning in. Remember, be good to yourself, be better to others, and catch us next week for another great episode of the podcast. Take care, everybody.
Hey, everybody. I want to talk about a product and platform that I absolutely love, and our latest sponsor, Interseller, the prospecting and outreach platform of choice for recruiters and sellers. Whether you're doubling down on business development or recruiting talent, Interseller does all the heavy lifting of finding contact data, automating the email and follow-up process, and syncs all that rich data into 20-plus CRM and ATS platforms. Reach out now and get going on a 2-week free trial and let them know you heard about it from Adam on the podcast today. Check out the link on the website. Appreciate it.
Wisdom is forever, but for us, it's time to go. Thank you for joining us. Luckily, we'll be back with our next episode soon, jam-packed with more incredible humans. Thank you for listening, subscribing, and sharing. To join the conversation, search the podcast on LinkedIn. And to catch up on past episodes and more info, please visit www.thepodcast.com.